That's what I'm talking about.
Even if you've never touched an arcade cabinet, you'd be hard-pressed not to recognize who this little yellow concave circle is. Pac-Man is one of the most instantly recognizable characters in pop culture history, and that's because creator Toru Iwatani's 1980 smash hit wasn't just charming and fun, but also incredibly innovative. Pac-Man was the first multicolored arcade game, the first game with cutscenes, and also the first arcade game to ever score a large female audience, and it capitalized on this increased market share to the tune of $14 billion in revenue to date. But while Pac-Man undeniably propelled gaming into the mainstream, it's rarely given credit for what I think is its most subtle but perhaps most interesting influence. That is, laying the groundwork for the survival horror genre.
What are you talking about?
Okay, now I know what you're thinking. There's no way I'm going to claim that the colorful, playful, and silly Pac-Man could possibly be related to Alone in the Dark, or Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Dino Crisis, Parasite Eve, and all the rest. GTFO, you've lost the plot, bro.
No thanks, bro.
Okay, hear me out. First of all, what's not horrific about a naked, starving person having to stumble around in the dark to escape evil spirits in a never-ending set of mazes until they've died too many times to continue on?
Could you really be in this town?
My pal and patron member Melancholy Geek actually played Pac-Man when it first came out, and he arrived at a similar conclusion.
Pac-Man was the very first video game I ever played, back in the early 80s on the Atari 2600. Back then, I didn't think of it as a horror game. Then again, I'm pretty sure at the tender age of 6, I wasn't aware of the concept that is horror in the first place. Or horrible ports, for that matter. Looking back now and knowing Namco's original game, I see things very differently. Pac-Man is terrifying. I mean, you're thrown into a labyrinth, hunted by ghosts, which, given the game's Japanese origin, is about as horrifying as it gets. And it's not just generic ghosts either. They have names, they have personalities, and your only way to fight them is by using a very limited resource that allows you to temporarily banish them until they return again, set out to kill you. Drop the bird's eye view, and no one will doubt that's some horror premise right there.
Well, that may sound a bit like overstatement, but I can't help but think of how Shinji Mikami's initial pitch for Resident Evil took place in a mansion haunted by spirits, because he couldn't think of anything scarier than evil spirits. Pac-Man's nothing but evil spirits. Now, of course, I'm not saying that Pac-Man is horror simply because it's dark and uses ghosts and you run away a lot. Context is key. Creator Toru Iwatani just wanted to make a wacky game about eating, and he was inspired by some very not scary properties like the manga Obaki no Otaro, Casper the Friendly Ghost, and even Popeye the Sailor eating spinach to power himself up. It's to Iwatani's credit then that he can take normally horrific stock elements and make them disarmingly approachable. But it's hard to argue that these scarier inclinations of these elements aren't lingering just below the surface, as most fan remakes ratchet up the horror, and even the Pac-Man episode in Amazon's Secret Level series turns the cute eating game into existential, From Software-esque body horror. Pac-Man is just asking to be returned into a full-fledged horror game, and as we'll learn later, it kinda was. Now, admittedly, it's not a perspective that many people subscribe to, nor has it been taken very seriously in the 40-plus years of Pac-Man's existence. All I found in my research was a tongue-in-cheek subreddit post, an equally unserious article, and one whole YouTube video by Pondering Pixels. But Pondering Pixels actually reminded me of a passage I just read in John Romero's autobiography, Doom Guy: Life in First Person. In Chapter 5 of this book, Romero reveals how Pac-Man's innovation revolutionized his perspective on game design for one particular reason.
Asteroids and Battlezone were about shooting and blowing stuff up. It was all kill or be killed. It seemed like most new games were derivative of one or the other. This was a different vibe. It was more task-oriented. You had to gather dots, and survival-oriented. You ran away or you died.
Survival, you say?
Well, well, well. How the turntables...
Okay, now we're cooking with gas.
Cooking with gas.
Cooking with gas.
Could Pac-Man be a survival horror forefather after all? Well, let's find out. And just so you don't think I'm playing word games to suit my confirmation bias, let's actually pin down what survival horror even is and whether Pac-Man measures up to that definition. Now, many people have had many good answers for this, but we'll use the one that even noted stickler under the Mayo likes. The one found in Mild Conviction's video called What is Survival Horror? The Genre's History and Defining Characteristics.
What is survival horror? The former tends to focus on vulnerability, isolation, puzzle solving, and running away from enemies just as much as, if not more than, directly engaging them. In fact, sometimes engaging is simply not even an option. One is more investigative and promotes the avoidance and participation of combat either in equal measure or with a stronger lean towards avoidance. Survival means choice. Decisions must be made to ensure you stay alive and make progress. True survival comes from a combination of three other things working in tandem: level design, enemy placement, and rewards.
Okay, so how does Pac-Man fit into this definition, if at all? Well, for starters, Pac-Man's not a traditional puzzle game by any stretch of the imagination, but it's not too much of a stretch to say that the intentional maze-like structure and configuration of enemies constitutes a bit of a puzzle or a brain teaser in and of itself, and it requires tighter strategy as the game gets increasingly more difficult. As for Pac-Man himself, he's alone and highly vulnerable, like most survival horror protagonists are. The ghost AIs alternate between different levels of pursuit and scatter patterns, but transform into full pursuit mode once you've eaten about 20 dots or so. And you do have the choice of going into the warp tunnels on either side of the map to slow down any ghost who pursue you, though. And if you're able to pick up an Energizer pill to go on the offensive and start eating the ghosts, it's only for a very short amount of time, because even if you eat the ghost, they travel back to the center of the maze to regenerate, and eventually they resume their normal patrols, so you're never completely rid of them. As Melancholy Geek reminded us earlier, you've got the classic survival horror staples of limited resources to slow or fight back against the ghosts, but this only works so well and for so long, and it's dependent on how smartly you chose to activate these features to make the most of them. Pac-Man has to make educated guesses using the means available to him and hope for the best, much like later survival horror games. But Mild Conviction also reminds us that exploration in survival horror is optional, but rewards the most dedicated.
Thus, it's common for a good portion of a game's map to be optionally accessible. With this type of structure, choice is embedded directly into the world.
Most survival horror games have you collecting health, ammo, and items like Signalis' stun batons that let you have impermanent ways to rebuff enemies for a time, not unlike how Pac-Man can slow or temporarily kill ghosts. In most survival horror games, you're asked to weigh the risk of expending your resources now or possibly banking them in case you need them that much more later on. Maybe you need to pull off a risky maneuver and try for a high-risk, high-reward kind of situation so that you're not put in a bad spot and left without meaningful choice later on. Now, you could say that Pac-Man's pill collection does induce a lot of tension as each dot eaten gets you closer to the AI upgrading itself and making it harder and harder to escape with victory. There's the constant threat of failure and no real agency that you have other than which route you pick to escape the ghosts. But Pac-Man's map is always fully visible, and you're required to pick up all the dots to win, so in essence your exploration is forced. You're not really engaging the risk-reward triage of most survival horror and having to make decisions based on your best guess for the moment and your hope that it will pay off in the end, which is part of the fun, part of the genre's appeal. So Pac-Man's really playing alongside survival horror here, and it isn't quite living up to the sense of choice and emergent gameplay that survival horror encourages. But while it may seem counterintuitive to think of Pac-Man as a survival horror game, Pac-Man does feature a lone, disempowered protagonist. The maps are kind of set up like puzzles, if we're being technically correct.
Technically correct. The best kind of correct.
You normally practice avoiding enemies over engaging them. Your only means of fighting back is temporary and limited, and there's a general sense of fear and tension throughout. There's a lot here that resembles the spirit and some of the mechanics of what we see in later Resident Evils and such. Melancholy Geek really drives this point home.
That leads me to the true psychological horror that is Pac-Man. Ultimate futility. It's teased with the maze's fake exits that just loop you right back into your hellish prison. The ghosts, in the end, are invincible. The best possible outcome for the player is to clear the maze, eat every pallet, only to, in classic Sisyphean fashion, have to start all over again. It's a cycle that repeats on, with your only faint hope being to maybe, just maybe, reach the aptly named kill screen, just to see your whole reality dissolve before your eyes. Don't be fooled by the bright colors, the funny names, and cute waka waka sounds. Strip all that away, and you'll see what I see. Pac-Man's messed up.
But if you've been shown all these similarities and Melancholy's rich baritone somehow doesn't convince you of the truth of the matter, that Pac-Man is at least survival horror adjacent,
Inconceivable!
then let's get to the real proof in the pudding, which is how many formative titles in survival horror's history actually borrowed from Pac-Man's playbook. Now, there are a ton of Pac-Man clones that are just copyright infringement bait, adding almost nothing but new colors and sound effects to the very basic Pac-Man loop of pellet eating inside a maze while being chased by enemies. But things started to change even as soon as 1981, when Akira Takaguchi and Masakuni Mitsuhashi created the crossover we didn't know we needed between Pac-Man and Alien called Uchu Jisosa Nostromo, or Space Vader Nostromo, or Nostromo as we'll call it from here on out. Nostromo was released only in Japan, so it's pretty hard to find any copies of. Most gameplay you see online is a port of some variety, with slightly different colors for instance. But if you wanted a working prototype for how Alien Isolation could work, or a good example of how Pac-Man was already influencing other burgeoning genres, look no further. Nostromo is widely looked on as one of the very first survival horror games ever made, if not the first. And not only that, it is a deft adaptation of Pac-Man's mechanics to the needs of the survival horror genre, such as it was. Naturally, you play as Ripley, and you start out in a little red-colored nook. From there, you enter a simple area with 8 storage containers. Within them, they have various items that resemble playing card suites like diamonds, clubs, hearts, and spades. You have to shoot out the walls of these containers and collect 4 of each suite to beat the level. But you have to fight the 300-second timer and also avoid the alien who's roaming the halls to do so. You can return to the red starting area as a safe zone in hopes the alien will pass you by if it's gotten too close, or you can hide in one of the storage containers once you've shot open the wall and gone inside for a bit. It's a pretty simple and sweet adaptation of Pac-Man's item collection and the whole avoidance of an unkillable enemy in a maze structure, but with a much less frantic and deliberate pace put to it. Now, judging by this design and how later levels would have the alien disappearing and reappearing at will, I can really see how this would have been a pretty scary game for the early 80s. Not only that, but it's a great proof that Pac-Man can have its elements effectively modulated into a much more deliberately tense and scary, horrific experience. Nostromo also stands out in great contrast to the actual Alien adaptation that came out for the Atari 2600 a year later in 1982, which is about the closest thing to a rip-off or a Ripley off, as you can imagine, all done to cash in on both Pac-Man and Alien hype.
You know, Burke, I don't know which species is worse. You don't see them fucking each other over for a goddamn percentage.
This game only gets credit here for changing the sprites a little bit because it is dead-ass just Pac-Man by any other name. But it is funny to see another game trying to meld Pac-Man and Alien into one thing, and while this game doesn't do anything new or really anything well, it at least compounded the cultural signaling that Pac-Man would be bleeding into scarier fare soon enough. Case in point is 1982's Haunted House by James Andresen for the Atari 2600. Haunted House is often said to be one of the very first survival horror games, and not just for its atmosphere, but its mechanics. In Haunted House, you control a pair of eyes as you traverse a top-down map of 24 rooms across 4 floors that are teeming with spiders and bats and a ghost. To win, you had to find all the pieces of an urn, but you could only pick up these urn pieces if you had first lit a match, which was symbolized by the edges of the map turning yellow. You'd still have to risk running into enemies because all items are in these corner pockets of the rooms, and only the first of 9 difficulty levels even showed you the surrounding room walls unless you lit a match. You could only carry 1 inventory item at a time, not counting the matches, which means that you'd have to put down that urn that you were assembling if you, for instance, wanted to pick up the scepter, which made you invisible to all enemies, or if you wanted to pick up the master key, which was hidden in later levels and was required to be found in stages 3 through 9 to progress through all those locked doors. You also only had 9 lives to win the game. The spiders were fairly slow, but the bats were much faster and could track the player a lot better. The most fearsome of all, though, was the ghost of Mr. Graves, the house's old owner, who chased you very quickly and could pass through walls in its relentless pursuit of you. So, Haunted House features a disempowered cartoon avatar, requires avoiding enemies and backtracking to pick up items, and only has limited means of escaping or rebuffing enemies, all done in a dark labyrinth. Sounds a bit Pac-Man, wouldn't you say?
Well, well, well. How the turntables
Or more accurately, it sounds like Pac-Man slowed down and stretched out yet again to fit the survival horror format that becomes so recognizable in entries like 1989's Project Firestart and Sweet Home, and on into the Alone in the Dark and Resident Evil games of the 90s. But do all these similarities and its influences on games that are considered, survival horror mainstays therefore make Pac-Man a survival horror game? And if so, was it one of, if not the first survival horror game? Well, let's check the tape. Now, as we said earlier, Pac-Man was by no means drafted up to be scary. Sure, it was dark, and it had ghosts that pursued you relentlessly, but its Waka Waka was endlessly lighthearted, as were its comedic cutscenes. So any horror you felt was likely quite particular to your sensibilities, as it was for young Melancholy Geek.
Pac-Man is terrifying.
Ah!
That said, it's undeniable that Pac-Man was intentionally subverting common horror tropes. And as for its gameplay, it's far more in line with modern survival horror, mechanically, technically speaking, than we're often led to believe. Pac-Man himself is isolated and disempowered, a must for a survival horror protagonist, and the game features classic horror elements like dark environments and being chased by ghosts, which, when you think about it, has a much scarier connotation in Japan where this game was created, and as Melancholy Geek pointed out in the Secret Level episode harped on, there's quite a sense of existential dread in the plight of this globular glutton, as he traverses an almost never-ending set of mazes, escaping the bad guy just to respawn and have to do it all over again, but this time with feeling. And while Pac-Man had no official puzzles, its levels and enemy designs and interactions are set up much like a brain teaser or a puzzle that you need to solve in order to win, especially so when you realize how predictable it can be. Levels require careful playing to get through unscathed, and they conceivably require a lot of backtracking to get all the pills, backtracking being often lauded as a survival horror staple because it causes you to come to terms with what you left behind on your first run. And if you'll recall, John Romero said that
it was more task-oriented. You had to gather dots, and survival-oriented. You ran away or you died.
The likes of which he'd never seen before. Choice about how to solve your disempowerment is scarce in Pac-Man, but there is some agency for you, like whether you want to try your luck at avoiding the increasingly difficult to avoid ghosts, or whether you'd like to fight back for a limited time by eating an Energizer pill. Also worth noting that even if you manage to eat a ghost, they return to the center of the maze to respawn, and much like Crimson Heads and RE Also worth noting is that even if you...
What are you talking about?
Also worth noting is that even if you manage to eat a ghost, they return to the center of the maze to respawn eventually, much like Crimson Heads and RE Remake would do unless you burned them up. Pac-Man's maps don't encourage risk-reward exploration, mind you, but you do have some choice in how to make enemies slow down by getting them to follow you through a warp hole. There is some room for affecting the outcome in subtle ways that survival horror fans are likely to appreciate from a design standpoint. But again, we ask, is that enough to make Pac-Man survival horror and satisfy our thought experiment today? I want to say yes, even if just facetiously, but I think I have to err on the side of no, with one big caveat. Okay, so why is it not? Well, the map lacks the fear of the unknown and lacks any risk-reward consideration because it's all fully visible at all times.
Rewards for exploration and rewards for defeating enemies are ultimately the driving force behind what a player is obligated to do in order to progress or discover more items. You carefully turn over every stone and the game rewards you with more of those precious resources you need to complete your mission. But that's if you choose to do so, because exploration and seeking items beyond what's needed for progress is optional.
Unlike Mild Conviction's definition that exploration be optional, Pac-Man requires complete exploration of the map, which doesn't encourage very emergent scenarios to come up where you have to make split-second decisions about how to use resources.
Essentially, ammunition and healing items are practically currency that you run the risk of spending in order to complete an encounter. And on a case-by-case basis, you must decide which is more valuable and should be saved for later, and which can be used right now. Ideally, it's neither, but you should always be ready and willing to choose one.
John Romero is also quick to point out in Doom Guy that the game is also fairly predictable once you get good at it because you could remove a lot of the tension and fear of failure by just memorizing the AI's behavioral patterns.
It didn't take me long to realize that the game followed a distinct pattern. The way the ghost pursued Pac-Man didn't randomly change at the start of a new game. It was all rigidly pre-programmed. I figured out a way to evade the ghosts in the early stages of the game, and it worked every time.
So no, in the final analysis, Pac-Man is not survival horror in the strictest sense, but I had to admit in my research for this thought experiment that its emphasis on avoidance of enemies in a dark maze with limited resources is absolutely something that Uchu, Gisosa Nostromo, and Haunted House took a step further mechanically, and which would eventually be improved and iterated upon by Project Firestarter and Sweet Home and Alone in the Dark and Resident Evil and all the rest on up to the RE and Silent Hill 2 remakes of today. So, while the conclusion of what Pac-Man's genre actually is probably unsurprising to you, I do hope that I've opened your eyes a little bit to the Pac-Man's impact on survival horror, and that it's not just about rhetoric or confirmation bias, but it's about a tangible contribution that can be felt down to just the very things you do in the game, what they look like, and to some degree, how the game feels, except with the volume turned up a little bit on the horror. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you fire up Pac-Man in an arcade, you'll pause a moment to consider whether the game's nearly as charming as it normally feels, or whether it's a bit spookier than you remember. Godspeed, and may you survive the Waka Waka indeed. Thanks for watching.
Pac-Man's messed up.
Before I go, I'd like to give a huge shout out to those of you generous enough to support my work by becoming a patron. Mark Neubauer, Deadforge, Hey Blondie, Yaksho, M, BBF and Bloxburg, and Melancholy Geek. And an extra special thank you to those of you donating at my highest paid tiers, The Nth Review and James Wyatt. Now, if you'd like to keep what few lights I have on, you should join these folks at patreon.com/midnightmedium or become a YouTube channel member or buy me a coffee and donate at PayPal. Also, check out my GOG and NordVPN affiliate links to support me with no extra cost to you. And if you aren't tired of me yet, check me out as I join Deadforge and Robert Yap in the Quad Damage podcast, where we talk first-person shooters with developers and content creators alike. God bless you, everyone, and I'll see you soon.